What if the beings we've been calling gods were never meant to be worshipped at all? What if the Sumerian scribes pressing reed styluses into wet clay in the lamplight of temple archives were recording something far more complex than divine mythology? Beneath the ruins of Uruk and Eridu, where the first cities rose from the Mesopotamian plain, thousands of tablets describe the Anunnaki not as transcendent deities dwelling in celestial realms, but as physical beings who walk the earth. Laboured in mines, complained about their working conditions, and eventually created humans to take over their tasks. The texts are precise, almost bureaucratic in their descriptions. They read less like religious hymns and more like administrative records of a hierarchy we've been misunderstanding for 5,000 years. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to ancient mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew about the gods. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this realization stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark as we reconsider what those ancient scribes were truly trying to preserve. The word we translate as quote 0 in Sumerian texts was never that simple. The cuneiform sign dingia, which Assyriologists render as quote 1 or quote 2, appears before the names of the Anunnaki in every text, but the Sumerians themselves might have meant something entirely different. When British museum curators first began cataloguing tablets in the 1880s, they imposed their own Victorian understanding of religion onto a civilization that may not have drawn the same lines between divine, terrestrial, and cosmic that we do. The Sumerians had no word for quote 3 as we understand it, no concept separating sacred from secular, and their descriptions of the Anunnaki read less like worship and more like chronicles of a powerful ruling class whose origins happen to be celestial. Imagine sitting in the British Museum's basement archives in 1884, surrounded by crates of clay tablets shipped from Mesopotamia. The curators opening those crates came from a world where gods were understood in a very specific way, where the sacred and profane were clearly separated, where worship meant one thing and one thing only. They saw the sign dingia, saw it appeared before certain names, and made an assumption that has shaped our understanding ever since. They called these beings gods because that was the only category they had for powerful beings from the heavens. But what if the Sumerians meant something closer to rulers, or masters, or those from above? The sign itself is a star, or the sky, a pictograph showing origin rather than divinity. When translator George Smith first read the flood narrative on tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, he famously became so excited he began removing his clothes in the reading room. But what excited him wasn't just the parallel to Genesis, it was how differently the Sumerian version treated its gods. They ate, they drank, they argued with each other, they made mistakes, they regretted decisions. Enlil decreed the flood in anger because humanity was too noisy. Ishtar regretted the destruction and wept, saying, quote 4, "These aren't distant transcendent deities. These are beings capable of poor judgment, emotional reactions, and visible grief." The Sumerian language had multiple ways to describe different types of power and authority. They had words for kings, for rulers, for landowners, for overseers. Yet when they wrote about the Anunnaki, they used dingia, the sky sign, the marker of those from above. Not those who created everything from nothing, or those beyond understanding, but specifically those whose origin was the heavens, the physical sky above the earth. The distinction matters because it changes everything about how we read the texts. If the Sumerians were recording the activities of powerful beings from elsewhere rather than worshipping incomprehensible gods, then the tablets become something closer to chronicles, administrative records of a time when humanity answered to authorities whose technology and knowledge placed them in a category we've been mistranslating as divine. Scholar Samuel Noah Kramer spent 50 years translating Sumerian tablets, and he noticed something peculiar. The relationship between Sumerians and their gods was formal, yes, and fearful, but also strangely businesslike. Humans built temples, provided offerings, performed rituals, but the texts describe this in language that sounds more like taxation and labour obligation than worship. The offerings weren't sacrifices to appease angry gods, but provisions for the Anunnaki who resided in those temples, managing territories and overseeing human productivity. When a city's god was angry, the tablets describe it not as moral judgment, but as dissatisfaction with the city's output or behaviour, the frustration of an administrator with an underperforming settlement. By the early 20th century, as more tablets were translated and published, some scholars began quietly questioning whether gods was really the right translation. But by then the interpretation was embedded in decades of academic literature, in museum catalogues, in every book written about ancient Mesopotamia. To change it would mean rethinking not just individual texts, but the entire framework of how we understood the ancient Near East. And so Dingir remained God in translation, even as the texts themselves described beings who acted nothing like any gods humanity had worshipped since. In the ancient city of Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest settlement on Earth, archaeologists unearthed tablets describing creation in terms that seem almost clinical. The Eridu Genesis, dating to around 1600 BCE but recording much older oral traditions, tells how the Anunnaki arrived when no city had been created, no settlement had been built, and how they organised the world not through divine acts of will, but through deliberate planning and physical labour. There are no hymns of praise in these passages, no calls to worship. Instead, the text reads like a foundation charter, describing how canals were dug, how boundaries were set, and how the first human beings were fashioned from clay not to worship gods, but to work the fields the Anunnaki no longer wanted to tend. The excavation of Eridu began in 1946 under Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd. What they found challenged conventional timelines of civilization. The earliest levels dated to approximately 5400 BCE, making it potentially the oldest continuously inhabited settlement yet discovered. But what struck the excavators was how deliberately planned even the earlier structures were. There was no gradual evolution from crude shelters to sophisticated buildings. The architecture appeared almost fully formed, with temple platforms built to specific orientations, drainage systems that showed advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering, and evidence of astronomical alignments that shouldn't have been possible for people just emerging from the Neolithic. The tablets found in Eridu's temple archives describe the city's founding with precision that seemed odd for mythology. They named the first structure built, the first leader appointed, the first assignments of land and resources. The Eridu Genesis text doesn't begin with "in the beginning the gods," but with after An, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag had created the black-headed people, they made the animals multiply everywhere, and made herds of four-legged creatures come into being on the plains. Black-headed people was the Sumerian term for humans, possibly describing literal appearance, or perhaps functioning as a designation, a category. The text treats human creation as one task among many in an organised settlement process. What's absent from the Eridu Genesis is as revealing as what's present. There are no prayers, no expressions of gratitude to the creators, no moral instructions about proper worship. The text simply states that humanity was created, that cities were built, that kingship was established, that civilization began under the direction of the Anunnaki. The first city was Eridu. Enki was assigned there. Then Bad Tibira, where Dumuzi was assigned, then Lerak, where Pabilsag was assigned. The text reads like an administrative document, parceling out territories and responsibilities with bureaucratic efficiency. When translators first worked through these passages in the early 1900s, they struggled with the tone. Where was the worship? Where was the reverence appropriate for a creation myth? The translator Arno Pobel, working from tablets in the University of Pennsylvania collection, noted in his commentary that the Eridu Genesis read more like a foundation charter than a religious text, as if the creation of humanity and the establishment of cities were simply projects undertaken by the Anunnaki, necessary infrastructure for whatever purposes they had come to accomplish on Earth. The text describes how vegetation flourished, how water flowed in the canals, how the Anunnaki brought forth everything necessary for civilization. But brought forth from where? The phrasing suggests they already possessed this knowledge, that they arrived carrying an existing blueprint for civilization, rather than developing it through trial and error on location. Eridu appeared, according to its own foundation documents, already possessing the technologies and organizational structures that should have taken centuries to develop. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented these things. They stated plainly that they were taught, that the Anunnaki instructed them in every essential craft and skill. The temple at Eridu, dedicated to Enki, was rebuilt 18 times over the millennia, each new structure built directly on top of the previous one. When archaeologists excavated down through these layers, they found that even the oldest temple, from the earliest level, showed sophisticated architectural knowledge. It wasn't primitive and gradually improving. It was already advanced in the beginning, following design principles that remained consistent through all 18 rebuilds. Someone had established a standard, and that standard was maintained for thousands of years. The most revealing text about the nature of the Anunnaki isn't a hymn or a prayer, but an account of a labour dispute. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets from Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE, describes how the Anunnaki themselves were divided into two classes: the senior Anunnaki, who made decisions, and the lesser Anunnaki, called the Igigi, who performed the actual labour of digging irrigation canals and mining operations. After 40 years of this work, the Igigi rebelled, burning their tools and surrounding the house of Enlil, the chief of operations. The text is shockingly specific about their complaints. The work was too hard, the conditions unbearable, and they demanded relief. This is the context in which humans were created, not as an act of divine love, but as a solution to a management problem. The Atrahasis epic was discovered on tablets excavated from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, during excavations in the 1850s. But the tablets were copies of much older texts, and the colophons, the scribal notes at the end of tablets, indicate these copies were made from originals dating back to the Old Babylonian period. The scribes were careful to note they were copying ancient texts exactly, that they weren't adding their own interpretations but preserving what had been written long before. The epic begins not with humanity but with the work assignments of the Anunnaki. The great Anunnaki, it says, had imposed the work on the Igigi. The Igigi were digging the canals, clearing the rivers, excavating the Tigris and Euphrates, and performing the heavy labour necessary to make the land between the rivers habitable and productive. The text specifies they dug for 40 years, not a symbolic number, but 40 actual years of exhausting physical labour. The Igigi grew weary. They complained among themselves, and finally they organised. Imagine the scene the tablets describe. At night, the Igigi gather. They've had enough. They burn their tools, the spades, the baskets used for carrying earth, the implements that have become symbols of their endless toil. Then they march, together, to the house of Enlil. They surround it. They demand he come out and face them. The text says, "Let us confront the counselor of the gods. Come, let us remove him from his dwelling." This is rebellion, organised protest, workers refusing to continue under intolerable conditions. These aren't mystical spirits or abstract divine beings. These are labourers who've reached their limit. Enlil is frightened. He sends word to Anu, the supreme authority, and to Enki, the clever one who solves problems. The council convenes. Enlil is angry, demanding to know who instigated the rebellion. The Igigi respond collectively. They all instigated it. The work was too hard. They weren't created for this. They want relief, and they want it now. There's no mysticism in this scene, no metaphor. It's a straightforward account of a labour dispute that reached the point of crisis. Enki proposes the solution. If the Igigi can't continue the work and the work still needs to be done, then create a worker who can take over the labour. The text uses specific language. Create a Lulu, a primitive worker, a being strong enough for the physical demands but manageable, obedient, designed for this purpose. Enki turns to the birth goddess, called Nintu or Beletili in this text, and gives her instructions. Mix clay with the flesh and blood of a god. The god chosen is Wi'ila, described as one who has rationality or intelligence. His slaughter and the mixing of his blood with clay will create beings with enough intelligence to understand and perform complex tasks, but not enough to question or rebel as the Igigi had. The tablets describe the mixing process, the shaping of the clay, the involvement of both Enki and the birth goddess in creating 14 pieces, 7 male, 7 female. These are the first humans, fashioned not in an act of divine creativity for its own sake, but as an engineered solution to a labour shortage. The text even specifies the purpose. Let him bear the yoke, let him carry the toil of the gods. Humans were created to work, to take over the burden the Igigi had refused to bear any longer. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about this, and it never frames human creation as anything other than practical, motivated by the Anunnaki's need for workers and their unwillingness to continue doing the work themselves. The name itself reveals something crucial. Quote 17 breaks down into quote 18, which translates roughly as quote 19 or quote 20. Anu was the sky, not metaphorically but literally. The cosmic space above the earth. When we read in the ancient texts that the Anunnaki were quote 21 quote, we might be reading not mythological poetry, but a statement about origin, a description of beings whose home was literally in the sky and who descended to earth for purposes the tablets describe in surprisingly practical terms. Samuel Noah Kramer, the foremost Sumerian scholar of the 20th century, noted that the Sumerians treated these beings with respect and fear, yes, but also with a kind of familiarity that seems odd if they were truly meant to be understood as untouchable divine entities. Kramer spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, translating tablets from the collection that rivals the British Museum's for depth and importance. In his 1956 book History Begins at Sumer, he catalogued 39 firsts in human history that appeared in Sumerian texts. But it was his work on the nature of the Sumerian pantheon that raised questions he couldn't fully answer. The Sumerians, he noted, had clear hierarchies among their gods. Not all were equal. Some were described as more powerful, more knowledgeable, more important than others. Anu stood at the top, but even Anu was described as aging, as passing authority to the next generation. As if divine power itself was heritable rather than eternal. The etymology of Anunnaki fascinated Kramer because it was so literal. Quote 24 could be broken into clear components. Anu, the sky, heaven. Ne, a possessive or connecting element. Ki, earth. Those who from heaven to earth came. The name described a movement, a descent, a journey from one realm to another. It wasn't poetic metaphor. It was description, as matter of fact as saying, those who from Europe to America came would be. The Sumerians had other names for other types of divine or spiritual entities. They had words for spirits, for demons, for protective beings. But Anunnaki was specific, reserved for this particular group whose origin was the sky and whose current location was Earth. In the Sumerian cosmology, Anu represented the highest heaven, the realm of stars and cosmic space. Ki was the earth, solid and material. The Anunnaki existed between, descended from Anu but dwelling on Ki. The texts frequently distinguish between the Anunnaki of heaven and the Anunnaki of earth, suggesting not different types of beings but different locations where members of the same group resided. Some remained in the sky realm, while others came down to earth. Those who descended took on specific responsibilities, were assigned to specific cities, oversaw specific aspects of the operation that was early Sumerian civilization. What struck Kramer was how the text treated the Anunnaki as physically present. They weren't invoked through prayer from some distant realm. They lived in temples. They moved between cities. Kings reported meeting with them, not in visions but in actual encounters. The text described their preferences, their personalities, their disputes with one another. Enlil was stern and quick to anger. Enki was clever and sympathetic to humans. Inanna was passionate and ambitious. These weren't abstract divine attributes, but personality traits. The kind you'd note about powerful individuals you actually dealt with. The number of Anunnaki appears to have been limited and specific. Various texts mention 50 great Anunnaki, 7 supreme Anunnaki who made decisions, and many more Igigi who performed labour. These weren't vague mythological multitudes. They were countable, identifiable populations. Lists exist naming the primary Anunnaki and their assignments. Such specificity is strange if we're talking about gods. Omnipotent beings don't need population counts, but makes perfect sense if we're talking about a colonial expedition with limited personnel. Kramer also noted the way Sumerian texts described the arrival of the Anunnaki. They didn't always exist on Earth. They came. Before their arrival, the texts say, humanity didn't exist. Cities didn't exist. Agriculture didn't exist. Then the Anunnaki came down and everything changed rapidly. Civilization appeared, not gradually over millennia, but suddenly, as if introduced by those who already possessed it and were transplanting it to new location. The Sumerians never claimed to have invented writing or mathematics or astronomy through their own efforts. They said these things were taught to them by the Anunnaki. Gifts or instructions from beings whose knowledge was already complete. In the Sumerian text known as, quote, 28, quote, we find what might be the most undivine creation story ever recorded. Enki, described as the chief scientist among the Anunnaki, is tasked with creating a worker to relieve the labouring Igigi. The text describes the process in terms that sound less like divine miracle and more like biological engineering. They mixed clay. But not just any clay. The text specifies the freshwater aquifer with blood from a slain god to create the first human. Ninmah, the birth goddess, is present not as a mystical figure, but as what reads almost like a chief medical officer. The experiments don't all succeed. The text describes several attempts that produced malformed beings before the mixture was correct. This is not how gods are supposed to work. This is trial and error, recorded by scribes who seem to see nothing strange about describing their creators this way. The tablets containing Enki and Ninmah were excavated from Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, where tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered since excavations began in 1889. The text exists in several copies, suggesting it was important enough to be preserved and recopied across generations. When translator Samuel Noah Kramer first published a full translation in 1944, he struggled with how to frame passages that described creation in such unexpectedly material terms. The story begins after the Igigi rebellion, after the decision has been made to create a replacement worker. Enki gathers the necessary materials and personnel. The text is specific about what's needed. Clay from over the Abzu, the freshwater aquifer that Enki controls. Not surface clay, not any clay, but specifically clay from this location. Modern readers might interpret this as purely symbolic, but the Sumerians made clear distinctions between different types of clay. They had specific terms for clay from different sources, used for different purposes. The specification suggests this particular clay had properties necessary for the procedure. Then comes the biological component, the blood of a slain god. The text names him Wheeler in some versions, Geshtui in others, and describes him as having spirit, ghost, rationality, or intelligence. His death is ritualized but deliberately executed, and his blood is mixed with the clay. The Sumerians understood that life came from life, that creation required essence from an already living being. The mixing of divine blood with earthly clay would produce beings that partook of both natures, physical bodies that could perform labour, and intelligence inherited from the sacrificed god, enough rationality to understand commands and perform complex tasks. Ninmah shapes the mixture. The text describes her speaking over it, activating it somehow, then placing it in a mould or container described as her quote 32 quote or quote 33 quote. This isn't instantaneous divine speech bringing something from nothing. This is a process, a procedure taking place in a specific location designed for this purpose. 14 figures are created in this first batch, 7 male, 7 female, suggesting the goal was a breeding population that could reproduce and expand naturally. But the experiments don't all work. The text then describes a remarkable section where Enki and Ninmah, perhaps celebrating with beer after their success, begin experimenting with variations on the mixture. What happens if you change the proportions? What if you add different components? The results are beings with various deficiencies. One cannot speak. One cannot control his bladder. One is too weak to lift his hands. One is barren and cannot reproduce. One has diseased eyes. One has trembling body. These failed experiments are still alive, still created, and Enki must find purposes or places for them, acknowledging they exist even though they didn't meet the design specifications. This passage is extraordinary because it describes exactly what you'd expect from a biological engineering process. Trial and error, failed experiments, unexpected results from modified procedures. Gods creating through pure will shouldn't produce mistakes, but scientists experimenting with genetic manipulation absolutely would produce varied results, some successful, some not. The text treats these failures matter-of-factly, not as divine mysteries but as problems to solve, variations to either correct or accommodate. The tone of Enki and Ninmah is almost playful in sections, suggesting the creation of humans wasn't a somber religious event, but a scientific project undertaken by beings confident in their abilities, willing to experiment, and capable of both success and failure. Ninmah challenges Enki to make use of the malformed beings. Enki finds roles or places for each, demonstrating that even failed experiments have value or can be accommodated. It reads like colleagues working together on a complex project, not gods conjuring humans from divine will alone. When archaeologists excavated Nippur, the religious centre of ancient Sumer, they expected to find temples full of hymns and prayers. What they found instead, in addition to liturgical texts, were thousands of tablets that read like bureaucratic records. Lists of the Anunnaki by name and function. Rosters assigning different deities to different cities and responsibilities. Inventories of offerings that seem less like sacrifices to appease gods and more like rations distributed to administrators. The cuneiform scholar Thorkild Jakobsen spent decades analysing these texts and noted how strangely practical they were, how the relationship between humans and Anunnaki was described in terms that would make sense for colonial administrators and their subjects, but seemed odd for worshippers and gods. The Anunnaki were assigned to specific locations, given specific tasks, and expected to fulfill them. They received provisions, they attended councils, they voted on decisions. These are not the actions of omnipotent deities. Nippur sat at the geographical centre of Sumer, approximately halfway between the Persian Gulf and modern Baghdad, in what is now central Iraq. The University of Pennsylvania began excavations there in 1889, and what emerged from the tell, the massive mound of accumulated settlement layers, was one of the most important textual archives ever discovered. Over 60,000 tablets and fragments have been recovered from Nippur, spanning more than 2,000 years of continuous occupation. The sheer volume of administrative documents was unexpected. These weren't prayers copied by priests or mythological epics preserved for posterity. These were working documents, records of daily operations, assignments and rosters that had actual practical function in the administration of Sumerian civilization. Jacobson, who served as director of the Oriental Institute's Uruk expedition and later taught at Harvard, became fascinated by what he called the, quote, 35 nature of the Sumerian pantheon. Reading through the Nippur tablets in the 1930s and 40s, he found lists organizing the Anunnaki by rank, by function, by geographical assignment. One tablet catalogued 50 great Anunnaki with their primary responsibilities. Another listed 7 supreme decision-makers. Still others assigned specific Anunnaki to specific cities, and to Uruk, Enlil to Nippur, Enki to Eridu, Nana to and so on through all the major settlements of Sumer. Each city had an assigned Anunnaki overseer, and each overseer had defined responsibilities within the larger administrative structure. The tablets tracking offerings to the temples read less like religious devotion and more like supply manifests. So many measures of barley per month to the temple of Enlil. So many animals, so much oil, so much beer delivered on specific schedules. The texts don't frame these as gifts to appease divine wrath or earn divine favour. They read like provisions, rations supplied to the Anunnaki residents of each temple and their staffs of priests and workers. One extensive tablet from the Ur Third period, around 2100 BCE, lists monthly deliveries to temples across Sumer with the precision of a logistics coordinator tracking supply chains. What Jacobson found most remarkable was the evidence of organizational meetings. The texts reference assemblies of the Anunnaki, councils where decisions were debated and voted upon. The word used, ukin, means assembly or council meeting, the same word used for human governmental assemblies. The tablets describe procedures which Anunnaki must be present for different types of decisions, how disputes between Anunnaki were arbitrated, how new policies affecting human populations were decided collectively, rather than by divine decree. One text describes Enlil calling an emergency council after the Igigi rebellion, gathering the senior Anunnaki to decide how to respond. Another records a council meeting to determine whether to destroy humanity in the flood, with the decision passing over Enki's objections. These are not gods operating on incomprehensible divine logic. These are administrators following procedures, working within an organizational structure, bound by rules that applied even to themselves. The tablets from Nippur suggest the relationship between Anunnaki and humans was formal, hierarchical, based on clear expectations and defined obligations on both sides. Humans provided labour and provisions. Anunnaki provided organisation, knowledge, and protection. The arrangement was transactional, not mystical, recorded in administrative texts because that's what it was, an administration, a governing structure that operated according to established policies that were documented and preserved. One detail appears with striking consistency across multiple Sumerian and Akkadian sources, the number 50. Various tablets refer to the 50 great Anunnaki, or describe Marduk as having 50 names, each associated with one of the original Anunnaki who descended. In an age when numbers in mythology were often symbolic and vague, this precision is curious. The Sumerian king list, which chronicles rulers from before the Great Flood, refers to the time after kingship descended from heaven, as if political authority itself came from the sky, along with those who wielded it. 50 is not the number you'd expect to find repeatedly in divine mythology, where pantheons swell to hundreds or remain at small archetypal numbers. 50 sounds like the crew of an expedition, a specific group sent for a specific purpose and remembered across multiple texts, because that was the actual number of Anunnaki who established the first settlements in Mesopotamia. The number appears in texts separated by centuries and found in different cities, suggesting it wasn't a scribal invention but a detail preserved from earlier sources. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, dating to around 1200 BCE but recording earlier material, describes Marduk receiving 50 names at the conclusion of the story, each name associated with one of the Anunnaki who acknowledged his supremacy. The text lists all 50 names with explanations of what each represents, or which Anunnaki bestowed it. This isn't symbolic numerology. This is careful enumeration, as if the number 50 had specific historical significance. In Sumerian astronomical texts, there are references to the quote 39 quote associated with celestial observation and the regulation of time. The Malapin tablets, which contain some of humanity's oldest astronomical records, reference 50 divine counselors who established the calendar and taught humanity to track celestial movements. The precision suggests these weren't vague mythological entities, but a specific group whose number was preserved because it mattered, because it was historically accurate. The Sumerian king list adds another layer to this pattern. This remarkable document, preserved on multiple tablets and prisms from different periods, chronicles every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until the time the lists were compiled. The most complete version, known as the Weld Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, begins with the phrase, quote 40, not quote 41, or quote 42. But when kingship was lowered, descended, came down from heaven to earth. Political authority, the list states plainly, originated in the sky and was transferred to earth as a gift or assignment from those above. The pre-flood section of the king list names 8 kings who ruled 5 cities, with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years each. Modern scholarship dismisses these as mythological, but the Sumerians recorded them in the same format, with the same matter-of-fact tone as the historically verified kings who came later. What if these early kings were of Anunnaki heritage, or Anunnaki themselves, whose lifespans were naturally much longer than human lifespans? The list makes no distinction in how it treats them. It simply states, this king ruled this city for this length of time, then kingship passed to another city and another king. After the flood, the king list notes quote 43 quote, and was established first in Kish. The reigns suddenly become much shorter, much more in line with human lifespans, as if something fundamental changed after the flood, as if the direct rule or direct heritage of the Anunnaki had been diluted or withdrawn. Yet the number 50 echoes through later texts. Preserved as the count of the original Anunnaki who had come, who had established civilization, who remained important enough that every Babylonian king who rose to power claimed legitimacy by honouring all 50 of them through Marduk's 50 names. 50 is a practical number for an expedition, large enough to accomplish significant work with diverse skills and capabilities, small enough to maintain cohesion and clear command structure. It appears in the text not as mythology, but as remembered fact, the actual number of Anunnaki who descended to Earth and established the first settlements, a detail preserved across thousands of years because it was true, because it mattered, because the Sumerians were recording history even when we insist on calling it myth. The texts repeatedly reference a council of 7 senior Anunnaki who made major decisions affecting both themselves and humanity. These 7, An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna in most lists, are described not as a mystical pantheon, but as an administrative hierarchy with clear roles and responsibilities. They held council meetings, they debated, they sometimes disagreed sharply, as recorded in flood narratives where Enki defies the decision of the other council members to destroy humanity. When archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated Ur in the 1920s and 30s, he found cylinder seals depicting these council scenes, with the Anunnaki seated in rows, identifiable by their distinctive horned headdresses, but rendered as physical beings in physical spaces. The imagery suggests authority and power, certainly, but not the transcendent divinity we associate with gods. More like a governing body whose authority derived from knowledge and technology rather than supernatural power. The Council of 7 appears so frequently in Sumerian texts that scholars gave it a designation, the 7 who decree fate. But the Sumerian term for decree, parsu, also means decision or judgment, and fate Namtar can mean destiny, but also simply future outcome or consequence. These 7 decided outcomes made judgments about future actions, decreed what would happen not through mystical foreknowledge, but through the authority to make plans and expect them to be implemented. They were decision makers, executives, the highest tier of administration. An, whose name simply means sky or heaven, held the highest position, but appears to have been somewhat removed from daily operations, residing in Uruk but not directly managing human affairs. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Air or Lord of the Command, functioned as the operational commander, overseeing the actual work of civilization building. Enki, Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Foundation, served as the chief scientist and engineer, responsible for creating humans and managing the Abzu complex. Ninhursag, Lady of the Mountain, worked alongside Enki in biological creation. Nana governed the moon, and the city of Eridu, associated with the sun, oversaw justice and law. Inanna, the youngest, governed warfare and later became associated with the planet Venus. These weren't abstract cosmic forces. The texts describe their personalities, their conflicts, their areas of expertise. Enlil was stern, focused on maintaining order and productivity, quick to anger when things didn't proceed according to plan. Enki was creative, sympathetic to humans he had helped create, willing to bend rules if he thought the situation warranted it. The conflict between them appears throughout Sumerian literature. Enlil wants to enforce strict policies. Enki finds loopholes and exceptions. In the flood narrative, this conflict becomes explicit. Enlil convinces the council to destroy humanity. Enki, bound by his oath not to reveal the plan directly, speaks to a wall of reeds where Ziusudra can overhear, technically keeping his word while ensuring human survival. Leonard Woolley's excavations at between 1922 and 1934 uncovered the royal tombs and thousands of artifacts that illuminated Sumerian civilization at its height. Among the cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with images that could be rolled across wet clay to leave an impression, were numerous depictions of divine councils. The scenes show the Anunnaki seated in rows, wearing their distinctive horned crowns, with human supplicants standing before them, or priests conducting ceremonies. But the Anunnaki are rendered as physical beings, not in abstract spiritual representation. They sit on chairs, they hold objects, they interact with the physical space around them. One seal shows 7 figures seated before a table or altar, with what appears to be a star or celestial object depicted above them. Another shows a council scene where one figure, identified by inscription as Enki, appears to be arguing a point while others listen. The body language is recognizable, human, the kind of scene you'd see in any administrative meeting where decisions are being debated. The artistry treats these beings as authorities, yes, as powerful and important, but not as transcendent gods beyond human understanding. They're rendered as rulers, officials, decision-makers, who happen to possess knowledge and capabilities that place them in positions of governance over early human populations. The texts describe council meetings with procedural detail, which matters required a full assembly versus which could be decided by fewer members. How disputes between council members were resolved. What happened when the council couldn't reach consensus? In some cases, the decision was deferred. In others, An's vote as supreme authority broke the tie. This is governmental procedure, administrative hierarchy, the kind of structure necessary for managing a complex operation with multiple responsibilities and limited personnel. In every Sumerian artistic representation, the Anunnaki are depicted wearing distinctive horned crowns. These crowns are so consistent across thousands of years of Mesopotamian art that they served as the primary visual identifier of these beings. But what did the horns represent? Modern scholars have assumed they were purely symbolic, representing divine power, but the Sumerian texts themselves never call them symbolic. They describe the horned crown as something the Anunnaki wore, an actual object. sometimes gifted to human kings who were elevated to special status. When Gilgamesh, the famous king of Uruk, sought immortality, he was told he could never have it because he lacked the fundamental nature of the Anunnaki, but he could be given certain privileges symbolized by receiving their regalia. The precision with which these crowns are always depicted, the multiple horns arranged in identical patterns, suggests they were real objects that served some purpose. Not artistic flourishes invented by sculptors. Look at any artifact depicting the Anunnaki, cylinder seals, relief sculptures, statues, temple decorations, and you'll find the horned crown. Not sometimes, not occasionally, but always. In early Sumerian art from 3500 BCE through Neo-Assyrian art from 700 BCE, across nearly 3 millennia, the design remains remarkably consistent. Multiple tiers of horns, usually arranged in parallel rows rising from a base that fits on the head. The number of horn tiers indicated rank, 7 tiers for the highest Anunnaki, fewer for lesser ranks. This wasn't artistic license. This was a systematic visual code, as precise and deliberate as military rank insignia. The horns themselves are rendered with careful attention to detail. They're not decorative flourishes. They're shown as physical components of a constructed object. In some depictions, you can see how the crown sits on the head, how it's secured, how the horns are attached to the base. Sculptors and seal carvers across centuries maintained this consistency, suggesting they were reproducing something they understood to be real, an actual object worn by the Anunnaki that needed to be depicted accurately. The texts occasionally mention the horned crown being transferred. When a human king was elevated to special status, given authority that extended beyond normal human rulers, the ceremony involved receiving elements of Anunnaki regalia. The texts don't describe this as metaphor. They state that the crown or other items were given, transferred from Anunnaki to human, conveying with them certain authorities or capabilities. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero seeks to avoid death, he pursues the secret of the Anunnaki's extended lifespan, but he's told explicitly he cannot achieve immortality because he lacks their essential nature. However, he can receive other privileges, other access, symbolized by possessing items that normally belonged only to them. What were these crowns? If we set aside the assumption that they were purely symbolic, what physical object might they have been? The consistent multi-tiered horn design appears in every representation, suggesting the horns served some purpose that required them to be arranged in that specific configuration. Some researchers have noted the resemblance to antenna arrays, to devices designed to receive or transmit signals. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as possessing knowledge and capabilities humans lacked, as being able to communicate across distances, as having access to information through means not available to humans. Could the horned crown have been technology rather than decoration? A device that functioned as communication equipment, navigation aid, or even identifier? Allowing other Anunnaki to recognize rank and authority? The precision of the depictions argues against pure symbolism. Symbols can vary, can be stylized differently by different artists. But the horned crown maintains its specific form across vast stretches of time and space, rendered by countless artists who all showed it essentially the same way. That kind of consistency suggests they were all reproducing something real, something that existed in standardized form, something too important to be depicted incorrectly. The Anunnaki wore these crowns, and every Sumerian and Akkadian artist knew exactly what they looked like, because they were actual objects that had to be rendered accurately. One of the most intriguing details in Sumerian texts is the repeated reference to Enki's dwelling in the Abzu. Modern translations call it the cosmic sweet water below the earth, treating it as mythological, but the texts describe it with architectural specificity. The Abzu had chambers, contained workshops where Enki conducted his experiments, held treasures and tablets of knowledge, and was accessed through specific entrances. The Sumerian text, Enki and the World Order, describes Enki laying the foundations of the Abzu and organising it with precision, establishing areas for different purposes. When you read these passages without assuming mythology, they sound like descriptions of an underground facility, a place where Enki conducted the work he couldn't or wouldn't do on the surface. Archaeological surveys in southern Iraq have revealed extensive ancient underground water channels and chambers, many still unexplored, that might correlate with these textual descriptions of a subterranean complex beneath Eridu. The Abzu appears in text after text as Enki's primary domain. He's called Lord of the Abzu, and hymns describe him organising it, securing it, filling it with treasures and knowledge. The location is specified, beneath Eridu, accessed through the temple complex extending deep into the earth. The texts mention specific chambers within the Abzu, the Room of Fate where Ninmah created humans, storage areas for the Mi, those devices or tablets containing essential knowledge, workshops where Enki conducted experiments, and what sounds like a throne room or council chamber where he received visitors. Enki and the world order provides the most detailed description. After establishing cities and organising civilization on the surface, Enki descends to the Abzu and begins organising it with the same systematic precision. He establishes its foundations, makes it secure, sets up what the text calls purification rites that might have been security procedures. He fills it with precious things, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, but also with knowledge tablets, with the Mi, with things the text describes as more valuable than material wealth. The Abzu becomes Enki's base of operations, where he keeps what matters most, where he conducts the work that can't be done openly on the surface. The texts distinguish between different levels or sections of the Abzu. There's the freshwater aquifer itself, the literal underground water source that fed Eridu's wells and canals. But there's also Enki's Abzu, a constructed complex within or beneath that aquifer, using the water as both resource and perhaps concealment. The descriptions mention walls, doorways, passages, suggesting built architecture rather than natural caverns. When Inanna descends to visit Enki and tricks him into giving her the Mi, the text describes her journey through multiple gates, passing through levels of the Abzu, suggesting a complex with security checkpoints and controlled access. Modern archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have revealed something unexpected beneath the ruins of Eridu. Extensive underground voids, some clearly ancient water channels, but others that appear to be constructed chambers and passages. The Iraqi government has restricted access to these areas, and conflicts in the region have prevented thorough exploration, but the surveys confirm that something significant exists beneath Eridu's surface. Ancient engineering on a scale that rivals anything built above ground. A subterranean complex that matches, at least in general terms, what the Sumerian texts describe as the Abzu. The purpose of the Abzu becomes clearer when you compile references from multiple texts. It was laboratory, archive, treasury, and fortress. It was where Enki kept knowledge too dangerous or too valuable to leave exposed on the surface. It was where genetic experiments in creating humans took place, away from observation, under controlled conditions. It was where the Mi were stored when not in use, protected in ways that made them extremely difficult to steal. Inanna's theft was described as a remarkable feat, requiring trickery because the Abzu's security was normally impenetrable, and it was refuge. A place Enki could retreat to, where he could work without interference from other Anunnaki, who might disapprove of his experiments or his sympathies toward humans. Sumerian texts frequently mention the Mi, usually translated as, quote, 52, quote, or, quote, 53, quote. But the texts treat them as physical objects that could be stolen, transferred, or lost. In the myth, quote, 54, quote, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and gets Enki drunk, then steals his Mi and carries them back to her city of Uruk in her, quote, 55. Enki, realizing what he's lost, sends servants to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes. The Mi are listed specifically. They include kingship, priesthood, various crafts, weapons, writing, music, and over 100 other concrete capabilities. These aren't abstract divine attributes. The text treats them as technology, or knowledge that could be physically possessed and controlled access to specific abilities. When Assyriologists first translated these passages, they struggled to make sense of how, quote, 56, quote, could be stolen and transported. But if we read me as devices or databases containing essential knowledge, the narratives become much clearer. The word me has no clear etymology in Sumerian. It's one of those terms that seems to have always existed in the language, suggesting it was borrowed from elsewhere or predated Sumerian linguistic development. The texts treat me as discrete, countable items, not one me representing all divine power, but many me, each associated with specific capabilities or areas of knowledge. Some texts list over 100 individual me, each carefully enumerated with its function. The story of Inanna's theft provides the most detailed account of how the me functioned. Inanna, ambitious and clever, decides she wants the me that Enki guards in the Abzu. She can't simply take them by force. Enki is more powerful, and the Abzu is his domain. So she visits him under pretense of social call, dressed in her finest regalia, acting as honoured guest rather than rival. Enki, pleased by the visit and perhaps lowering his guard, offers her food and beer. The text is explicit that they feast together, that Enki drinks generously, that his judgment becomes impaired. Then Inanna makes her move. She asks for me, one by one, and Enki in his intoxicated state begins giving them to her. The text lists them as he hands them over. The me of lordship, the me of godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted sceptre, the royal insignia, the exalted shrine, shepherdship, kingship, lasting ladyship, divine office, the priestly office. The list continues through professions and crafts: the Ashib priest, the Luma priest, truth, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, the art of love-making, the kissing of the phallus, the cult prostitute, the standard, the flood, weapons, sexual intercourse, prostitution, law, libel, art, music, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, falsehood, rebel lands, goodness, justice, wood and metalworking. Scribal craft, craft of the smith, leatherworker, builder, basket weaver, wisdom, attention, holy purification, fear, terror, strife, peace, weariness, victory, counsel, troubled heart, judgment, decision-making. Over 100 and me, each representing a specific capability or body of knowledge. These aren't abstract concepts. The text describes Inanna physically taking them, loading them into her boat of heaven, securing them for transport. When Enki sobers and realizes what he's given away, he's horrified. He sends his vizier Isimud to catch Inanna and retrieve the me before she reaches Uruk. The chase that follows is physical, desperate. Enki sends supernatural servants called Lahama to stop her. At each of the 7 gates between Eridu and Uruk, Inanna must defend her stolen cargo. But Inanna reaches Uruk with the me intact, and once they're installed in her city, Enki can't reclaim them. The me, whatever they were, conveyed authority and capability that couldn't be revoked once transferred to a new location. Uruk gained everything on that list: crafts, professions, administrative capabilities, cultural practices, not through gradual development but suddenly, all at once, because Inanna brought the me there from Enki's storage in the Abzu. If we read me as devices, as what we might call databases or instruction sets containing the accumulated knowledge for specific technologies and practices, the story makes perfect sense. Enki possessed the complete library of Anunnaki knowledge, stored in the Abzu for safekeeping. Inanna stole a substantial portion of it and established her city as a new centre of advanced civilization, no longer dependent on Enki's sole control of essential information. The me weren't blessings or supernatural gifts. They were knowledge, transferable, stealable, physical enough to be carried in vehicles and secured in temples once acquired. The Sumerian flood narrative, which predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years, describes the Great Deluge not as divine punishment for sin but as a deliberate decision made by the Anunnaki Council to solve what they viewed as a problem. The tablet known as the quote, 57 quote states that humanity had become too numerous and too loud, disturbing the rest of the senior Anunnaki, particularly Enlil. The council decided in secret to destroy humanity through a flood, but Enki, who had been instrumental in creating humans, disagreed with this decision. He couldn't oppose the council openly, so he spoke to the wall of a reed house where Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, was sleeping, technically revealing the plan without breaking his oath. The text is clear. This was a planned event, decided in council, with specific purposes, and one member of that council worked around the rules to save a remnant. This is political maneuvering, not divine caprice. The flood appears in multiple Mesopotamian sources, each adding details that illuminate the Anunnaki's reasoning. The Atrahasis epic provides the most extensive account of the events leading to the decision. After humans were created to relieve the Igigi from labour, the population expanded rapidly. Humanity spread across Mesopotamia, building settlements, cultivating fields, multiplying exactly as they'd been designed to do. But the noise, the text specifically mentioned noise, tumult, the uproar of human activity, disturbed Enlil. The tablets describe Enlil lying awake, unable to rest because of humanity's racket. He brings the complaint to council. Initially, the Anunnaki try other solutions. They send plague to reduce the population. When it recovers, they send drought to thin the numbers. When humans adapt and survive, they try famine. Each time, Enki finds ways to help humans survive, teaching them techniques to preserve food, find water, resist disease. The text portrays Enki as protector of his creation, unwilling to see humans destroyed for the crime of being too successful at surviving. Finally, Enlil demands a permanent solution. He calls a secret council and proposes the flood. The Anunnaki will send a deluge that will wipe out humanity completely, solving the noise problem by eliminating its source. The council agrees, swearing an oath not to reveal the plan to humans. Enki is bound by this oath. He cannot directly tell humans what's coming. But he's too clever to be completely constrained by such restrictions. The text describes how Enki goes to the reed house where Ziusudra sleeps. He doesn't speak to Ziusudra. He speaks to the wall, talking as if to himself, saying, reed house, wall, wall, hear me. Dismantle your house, abandon your possessions, save your life. Build a boat of these dimensions, make it watertight, take aboard specimens of all living things. Ziusudra, sleeping inside, overhears these words. Enki has technically kept his oath. He didn't reveal the secret to a human. He simply spoke where a human happened to overhear. Ziusudra builds the boat according to Enki's specifications, secretly given through this loophole. He loads it with his family, with craftsmen who possess essential skills, with breeding pairs of animals, with seeds of all plants. When the flood comes, Ziusudra survives. The texts describe the deluge with vivid detail. 7 days and 7 nights of rain, the dikes giving way, the cities flooding, humanity drowning. The Anunnaki themselves are described as frightened by the destruction, retreating to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs as they watch the devastation they've unleashed. When the waters recede and Ziusudra's boat comes to rest on a mountain, the survivors emerge to find a world emptied of human life. Enlil arrives to inspect the success of his plan and is shocked to find survivors. No human was to escape, he rages, demanding to know who violated the oath of secrecy. Enki carefully explains his technical compliance. He spoke to a wall, not to a human. The text suggests Enlil understands he's been outmaneuvered, but the survivors exist. They cannot be unmade. And Enki argues that humanity shouldn't be entirely destroyed, that if the Anunnaki have complaints about human behaviour, there are better solutions than genocide. The council agrees to let the survivors live, but with conditions. Humanity will be limited, their lifespan shortened, their numbers controlled through natural checks rather than catastrophic intervention. This wasn't divine mercy after moral repentance. This was compromise after a policy decision went wrong, after one council member successfully subverted the majority's plan, after the Anunnaki realized that complete extermination was both harder than expected and perhaps undesirable. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian text, contains a detail modern readers often overlook. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, he doesn't pray to the gods or build temples seeking divine intervention. Instead, he undertakes a physical journey to find Utnapishtim, the Sumerian flood survivor who had been granted immortality by the Anunnaki. The epic describes a real geographical journey, scholars have traced the route, through forests and across mountains to a place at the end of the earth where Utnapishtim lived. When Gilgamesh arrives, Utnapishtim tells him that immortality was a special dispensation granted to him alone after the flood, that it wasn't a divine quality but a modification of his physical nature made by Enlil. Gilgamesh is told there is a plant of youth at the bottom of a specific body of water which he finds and retrieves before it's stolen by a serpent. These are not the vague, metaphorical journeys of later religious texts. These are specific locations and physical objects. Gilgamesh was king of Uruk, described in the epic as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, suggesting mixed Anunnaki human heritage. His great strength, his near immortality, his capabilities beyond normal humans all stemmed from this genetic makeup. But when his beloved friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh confronts mortality with desperation. If he's 2/3 divine, why must he die like humans? Why can't he have the immortality of the Anunnaki? He decides to seek out the one human who escaped death, Utnapishtim, called Ziusudra in earlier Sumerian texts, the survivor of the flood who had been granted extended life. The epic describes Gilgamesh's journey in geographical terms. He travels through the cedar forest, encounters scorpion beings who guard the passage through the mountains, traverses a tunnel of darkness that takes 12 double hours to cross, emerges at the shore of the waters of death. These aren't symbolic locations. Scholars have identified the cedar forest as the mountains of Lebanon, the tunnel as potentially a passage through the Zagros Mountains, the waters of death as possibly the Mediterranean or Persian Gulf. At the shore, Gilgamesh finds Urshanabi, the ferryman who can cross the waters of death. Together they journey to where Utnapishtim lives, in a place described as being at the edge of the world, in the realm where the Anunnaki retreated after the flood. When Gilgamesh finally stands before Utnapishtim, he demands to know, "How did you achieve immortality? How can I escape death?" Utnapishtim tells him the flood story from the perspective of the survivor, explaining that he lives forever not because he earned it through virtue, but because Enlil granted it to him after the deluge. Utnapishtim had saved civilization by preserving humans, animals, and knowledge through the catastrophe. Enlil, recognizing this service and perhaps feeling some guilt for the attempted extermination, modified Utnapishtim's physical nature. The text says Enlil touched his forehead, blessing him with life like the gods. This wasn't spiritual transformation. This was biological modification, changing something fundamental in Utnapishtim's body that prevented aging. But, Utnapishtim explains, this was a unique dispensation, never to be repeated. Gilgamesh cannot have it. The flood was a one-time crisis. Utnapishtim's reward was specific to those circumstances. Immortality isn't available to others, not even to a king who's 2/3 Anunnaki. Gilgamesh despairs, but Utnapishtim's wife takes pity on him. She convinces Utnapishtim to tell Gilgamesh about a secret. At the bottom of the cosmic ocean grows a plant of youth. Not immortality, but rejuvenation, the ability to restore youth and extend life significantly. Gilgamesh dives to retrieve it. The text describes him tying stones to his feet to sink deep enough, finding the plant, cutting it free, returning to the surface. He has it. He plans to bring it to Uruk, test it on an old man to verify it works, then use it himself repeatedly to maintain youth indefinitely. But on the journey home, Gilgamesh stops at a well to bathe. He leaves the plant unguarded on the shore. A serpent, attracted by the plant's scent, emerges and swallows it. The serpent immediately sheds its skin. The plant worked, restoring youth, and disappears back into the water. Gilgamesh weeps. He came so close. He held the solution in his hands and lost it through carelessness. The epic ends with him returning to Uruk, resigned to mortality, finding meaning instead in the city he built, the legacy that will survive his death. But the story makes clear, immortality was real. Achievable through biological intervention by the Anunnaki. The plant of youth existed in a specific physical location. These weren't metaphors for spiritual enlightenment. These were concrete possibilities that Gilgamesh pursued through physical action, nearly achieved, and lost not to divine judgment, but to simple misfortune. The Sumerian king list is one of the most puzzling documents from the ancient world. It lists kings who ruled before the Great Flood with reign lengths of tens of thousands of years. Then after the flood, reign lengths suddenly dropped to hundreds or tens of years, much more in line with normal human lifespans. Conventional archaeology dismisses the pre-flood reigns as mythological, but the Sumerians themselves made no distinction in how they recorded these rulers. The text treats them all as historical, noting which city each king ruled and specific accomplishments. The pre-flood kings had names that included the element of Anunnaki names, suggesting close connection or mixed heritage. After the flood, the king list notes, kingship descended from heaven once more, re-establishing political authority. If we take the text at something closer to face value, not necessarily accepting the impossibly long reign lengths, but accepting that there were rulers before the flood whose relationship to normal human lifespan was different, then the king list becomes a record of transition from a time when those with Anunnaki heritage ruled to a time when purely human kings held power. The most complete version of the king list survives on the Weld Blundell prism, a clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The scribe who compiled it claimed to be creating a comprehensive list of every legitimate ruler since kingship began. The text opens with that remarkable phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Not when humans first organized into kingdoms, but when kingship descended, was given, came down from the realm above. The pre-flood section lists 8 kings ruling 5 cities. Alulim ruled Eridu for 28,800 years. Alanga ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. The numbers seem absurd, impossible, clearly mythological, except the Sumerians recorded them in the same format, with the same matter-of-fact tone as they recorded the historically verified kings who came later. No indication that these early entries were different in kind from the later ones, just rulers, cities, reign lengths, all documented in consistent administrative style. What if the numbers, while perhaps not literally accurate, reflected something real? What if these pre-flood kings were Anunnaki themselves, or carried enough Anunnaki genetics that their lifespans were dramatically extended compared to purely human rulers? The texts say Gilgamesh lived for 126 years, exceptional for humans, but nothing like the pre-flood kings. Yet Gilgamesh was 2/3 Anunnaki. What if those early rulers were more purely of Anunnaki heritage, and their recorded reign lengths, while perhaps exaggerated or mistranslated through the centuries, reflected their genuinely extended lifespans? The names themselves are suggestive. Many incorporate elements found in Anunnaki names or titles. The repetition of N as a prefix, meaning Lord, and suffixes connecting to Anunnaki designations suggest these weren't fully human rulers, but beings with direct Anunnaki connection or heritage. They ruled before the flood, before the decision to limit humanity, before the genetic dilution that followed the catastrophe. Then the king list records, quote 66, quote, after that single line acknowledging the catastrophe, it notes, quote 67, kingship descended again, re-established from above. But something fundamental had changed. The first post-flood king, Ga ruled for 1,200 years, still exceptional by human standards, still suggesting mixed heritage, but dramatically less than the pre-flood rulers, and the reigns continue to shorten. By the time we reach historically verified kings in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, reign lengths are 30, 20, 15 years, normal human lifespans. The king list charts a clear arc of declining longevity, as if each generation carried less Anunnaki genetics, as if the flood had successfully broken the direct line of mixed heritage rulers and established a new pattern where purely human kings held power, supported by Anunnaki, but no longer descended from them. The text treats this transition as historical fact, recording the change without explaining it, assuming readers understood what had happened, why the reigns shortened, what the flood had altered about humanity's relationship to those who had created them. Multiple Sumerian texts refer to the Anunnaki travelling in what are translated as boats of heaven or sky chambers, but the descriptions don't match what we'd expect from poetic metaphor. When Inanna travels to visit Enki and Eridu, she travels in her boat of heaven, loading the me into it for transport back to Uruk. The texts describe these vehicles with phrases like that which shines and that which roars. In the text Inanna's descent to the underworld, she abandons her boat of heaven and her me before descending, suggesting these were actual possessions, not spiritual attributes. The Gudea cylinders from around 2100 BCE describe the ruler Gudea being taken up into a structure that gleams like heaven, where he receives architectural plans from the god Ningish-Zida. Reading these passages without assuming they're purely symbolic, they sound like descriptions of vehicles or craft, specific enough that the scribes use consistent terminology for them across multiple texts and centuries. The Sumerian term, usually translated as quote 75, quote, is magur, where ma means boat or vessel, and gur relates to circling, going around, or encompassing. The full phrase might more accurately be quote 76, quote, or quote 77, quote. The consistency of this terminology across hundreds of years suggests it referred to something real, something every scribe understood and described the same way. When Inanna steals the me from Enki, the text describes her loading them into her magur and departing rapidly before Enki realizes what's happened. The vehicle is described as rising up, as gleaming, as capable of travelling from Eridu to Uruk much faster than any ground-based transportation could have managed. Enki sends servants in pursuit, but Inanna reaches Uruk before they can intercept her, suggesting these craft were fast, manoeuvrable, capable of direct routes that ignored terrain. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, the goddess must abandon both her boat of heaven and her me before descending to the realm below. The text is explicit that these are possessions she leaves behind at the entrance, tangible things that cannot accompany her into the underworld. She leaves them with her servant Ninshubur, who guards them while Inanna is below. When Inanna is rescued and returns to the surface, she reclaims her boat of heaven and her me, using the boat to travel back to Uruk. These aren't spiritual metaphors. These are described as equipment, as transportation and technology that the Anunnaki owned and operated. The Gudea cylinders provide even more specific details. Gudea, ruler of Lagash around 2100 BCE, commissioned 2 large clay cylinders inscribed with the account of how he built a temple for the god Ningish-Zida. In a dream or vision, the text is ambiguous about whether Gudea was asleep or awake. Ningish-Zida takes Gudea up to a structure described as gleaming like the sky, brilliant, surrounded by light. Inside, Ningish-Zida shows Gudea architectural plans for the temple, drawn with precision on what sounds like a tablet or board. Gudea sees measurements, specifications, exact dimensions for every aspect of the structure he's being commanded to build. The description of being taken up to this gleaming structure uses language similar to other references to the boats of heaven. It rises, it shines, it exists in a realm above the earth. Gudea is brought inside, shown plans, then returned to the ground, with instructions to follow those specifications exactly. The Cylinder's text treats this as a real event, not purely visionary. Gudea saw actual architectural drawings, received concrete measurements, witnessed engineering knowledge that he then implemented in constructing the temple. Other texts mention the Anunnaki travelling between cities in these craft, moving from one temple to another, journeying from earth to heaven and back. The descriptions use consistent terminology. They shine, they roar, they rise up, they circle. They move through the sky. The sound is particularly interesting. Multiple texts mention a roaring sound associated with these vehicles, suggesting propulsion of some kind, mechanical operation that produced noise as a byproduct. Silent divine miracles don't roar. Machines with propulsion systems do. Enlil's temple in Nippur was called the Ekur, which translates as quote 79 quote or quote 80 quote, but the texts describe it in ways that don't quite match a temple. It had a foundation which fills the waters, it contained what are called heavenly stars inside, and its radiance reaches to the heavens. When archaeologists excavated the Ekur mound in Nippur, they found a massive platform made of millions of baked bricks, far more elaborate than other temple foundations, suggesting it supported something of unusual weight or importance. The hymn to the Ekur describes it as a place where destinies are decreed, where the tablet of fate is kept, where Enlil observes all the lands and makes decisions about human affairs. The language suggests both an administrative centre and an installation with capabilities beyond what we'd expect from a temple. What was the Ekur really? The Sumerians built it with reverence and fear, surrounding it with massive walls, treating it as the most important structure in all of Mesopotamia. The Ekur dominated Nippur's skyline for millennia. When the University of Pennsylvania expedition began excavating the mound in 1889, they found layer upon layer of rebuilding, each generation reconstructing the structure on top of the ruins of what came before. The earliest levels dated to around 5000 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously maintained religious sites in human history. But what struck the excavators was the foundation, a massive artificial platform built from millions of baked bricks, engineered with precision that seemed excessive for a simple temple. The platform measured over 100 feet on each side and rose dozens of feet above the surrounding plain. The bricks themselves were unusual, uniform in size, fired at high temperatures for exceptional strength, laid in patterns that distributed weight efficiently across the entire structure. This wasn't crude ancient construction. This was sophisticated engineering, built to support something heavy, something important, something that required a foundation far more substantial than other temples possessed. The texts describe the Ekur in language that mixes architectural and almost technological terminology. One hymn says it has a quote 85, suggesting it was built over or connected to underground water sources, perhaps drawing on the same aquifer system that fed Enki's Abzu. Another passage mentions heavenly stars contained within the Ekur, which translators have struggled to interpret. Were these actual celestial objects somehow housed inside? Were they representations? Or was the term describing something else entirely, something that shone like stars but served a different purpose? The Ekur's quote 87 appears in multiple texts. The structure glowed, or shone, or emitted light in ways that impressed the Sumerians enough that they recorded it repeatedly. Normal temples, even those decorated with precious metals and colourful glazed bricks, wouldn't naturally radiate light upward. What about the Ekur produced this effect? Was there something inside that generated illumination? Something atop the platform that caught sunlight in remarkable ways? Or was this description of something more active, more technological? The hymn to the Ekur describes Enlil sitting within it, surveying all the lands, making decisions about human affairs. The text says he raised his eye and it searched the land, and his word changes the fate of all things. This surveillance and communication capability sounds less like a god mystically perceiving everything, and more like an installation with observational equipment, perhaps communication devices, ways of monitoring distant territories and transmitting commands across the realm Enlil administered. The Tablet of Destinies resided in the Ekur, according to multiple sources. This wasn't decorative placement. The Ekur was where supreme authority physically resided, where the device that conveyed ultimate power was kept and protected. When the bird being Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies in that particular myth, he steals it from the Ekur, from Enlil's seat of power. The security around the Ekur, the massive walls, the restricted access, the reverence mixed with fear, all suggest this was more than a religious site. It was the command centre, the installation where Enlil exercised control over Sumerian civilization, where he kept the technology that made his authority absolute. Archaeological evidence supports the text's emphasis on the Ekur's importance. The entire city of Nippur was organised around it. Major buildings clustered near the Ekur complex. Walls enclosed it separately from the rest of the city, creating a sacred precinct that was heavily fortified. Access was strictly controlled. Only priests and select officials could enter. The Sumerians treated the Ekur as the most important location in their world, the place where the supreme authority among the Anunnaki resided, and from which all Mesopotamia was administered. What was housed atop that massive platform? The Sumerians called it a temple because that was the closest concept they had. But the descriptions, the engineering, the capabilities attributed to it suggest something beyond a building for worship. The Ekur functioned as headquarters, as communications centre, as the location where the highest level Anunnaki technology was installed and operated. Enlil lived there, yes, but he also worked there, using equipment we can only glimpse through the poetic language of hymns that called technology by names their composers could understand. Radiance, heavenly stars, foundations that filled waters, words that changed fates. The texts are explicit about a hierarchy among the Anunnaki themselves. The senior Anunnaki, numbering around 50, made decisions and held authority. But there were others, called the Igigi, who performed the actual physical labour. In the Atrahasis epic, after 40 years of digging canals and other exhausting work, the Igigi rebel. The text describes them gathering at night, burning their tools, marching to Enlil's house, and demanding an end to their unbearable working conditions. This is not mythological poetry. It's a labour dispute recorded with the kind of detail you'd find in a historical chronicle. Enlil calls an emergency council of the senior Anunnaki. Enki proposes the solution. Create a primitive worker by mixing clay with the blood of one of the rebels, We'ila, who's described as having Vanda, quote 90. This mixing would create a being with enough intelligence to follow instructions, but without the full capabilities and lifespan of the Anunnaki. The council agrees, and humans are fashioned specifically to take over the work the Igigi refuse to continue. The distinction between Anunnaki and Igigi appears throughout Mesopotamian texts, maintained consistently across centuries. The Anunnaki were the senior group, those who descended from heaven to establish civilization, the decision-makers and administrators. The Igigi were their workers, beings who also came from above but who occupied a lower status, assigned to physical labour rather than governance. The hierarchy was clear, acknowledged, and apparently resented by those on the bottom. The Atrahasis epic describes 40 years of labour. For 40 years, the Igigi dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, excavated irrigation canals, cleared land, performed the heavy work of making Mesopotamia habitable. The text specifies the time frame as if it were important, as if the Igigi had endured for a specific recorded period before reaching their breaking point. 40 years of dawn to dark labour, of digging in the mud and heat, of exhaustion that accumulated until it became unbearable. Then comes the night when they decide they've had enough. The text describes them gathering after dark, discussing their grievances, building courage to confront their overseers. They burn their tools, the spades, the baskets, everything that symbolized their endless toil. The burning is an act of defiance, a statement that they refuse to continue, that they're willing to face consequences rather than return to the canals. Then they march to Enlil's house, surround it, demand he come out and address their complaints. The language is remarkable for its specificity. The Igigi speak as one, calling Enlil the counselor of the gods, demanding he emerge from his dwelling. They're angry, exhausted, past caring about protocol or hierarchy. The text records their words, quote, 92, quote, "These are workers at the end of their endurance, stating their case with the clarity of those who have nothing left to lose. Enlil is genuinely frightened. He sends word to Anu, the supreme authority, and to Enki. The three meet in emergency council. Enlil demands to know who organized the rebellion, who spoke first, who incited the others. The Igigi respond collectively. Quote, 93. There is no ringleader to punish. They acted together, and they stand together in their refusal to continue. This is where Enki's solution emerges. The work still needs to be done. The canals must be dug, the fields cleared, the labour performed. But the Igigi cannot be forced to continue. They've demonstrated they'll resist, and the senior Anunnaki are outnumbered. So create a new worker, Enki proposes. Fashion a being from the earth, mix it with the essence of the Igigi themselves so it has enough intelligence to understand complex tasks, but make it fundamentally different, designed for labour, with a short enough lifespan that rebellion won't accumulate across generations. The council agrees. They select Withdrawal, one of the Igigi. Described as having, quote, 94 or, quote, 95, his selection seems almost sacrificial. One of the workers will die so that a new race of workers can be created to replace them all. The text doesn't dwell on Wheeler's thoughts about this, doesn't give him voice or choice. He is slaughtered, his blood mixed with clay, and from that mixture the first humans are fashioned. The Igigi are released from labour, assigned instead to supervisory roles, while the newly created humans take over the physical work they no longer wanted to perform. The creation passages in texts like Enki and Ninmah and the Atrahasis epic describe a process that scholars have struggled to interpret satisfactorily as myth. The texts say that clay was mixed with blood, specifically blood containing what the Sumerians called Teema, usually translated as personality or spirit, but possibly meaning something more like essence or essential nature. Ninmah, described as skilled in birth procedures, creates humans in what the text calls her room of fate, using moulds or mixtures that are refined over several attempts. Early attempts produce beings with various deficiencies, too weak, unable to control their limbs, unable to reproduce. The texts read like a laboratory record of genetic experiments, recorded matter-of-factly by scribes who saw nothing impossible about their gods creating life through physical procedures involving biological materials. Ninmah shapes the clay, speaks life into it, possibly activating it through some process, and eventually creates humans who can work, reproduce, and serve the purpose for which they were designed. The word Teema appears in the creation texts with a specificity that suggests technical meaning. Modern translators have rendered it variously as personality, spirit, ghost, or essence, but none of these captures what the Sumerians might have meant. T relates to approach, nearness, presence. EMA can mean utterance, speech, or word. Together, Teema might mean something closer to living instruction, or essence that carries information. When Wheeler's blood, containing his Teema, was mixed with clay, it transferred something biological from the Igigi to the new creation, not just physical material, but information. the genetic instructions that would give humans intelligence. The mixing itself is described with procedural detail. Clay from over the Abzu, specific clay with properties necessary for the process. Blood from a slain Igigi, biological material containing the essential template. The two mixed together in proper proportions, worked until homogeneous. Then Ninmah, working in her quote, 104 quote in the Abzu complex, shapes the mixture. Some translations suggest she used moulds, creating multiple figures simultaneously. Others describe her forming each being individually, speaking over it, activating it through words that might have been formula, incantation, or specific sounds that triggered biological processes. The first attempts don't all succeed. The text describes several failed experiments. One being cannot lift its head, another cannot control his bladder or bowels, a third is too weak to hold anything, a fourth is born without sight. These failures aren't glossed over or hidden. They're documented, analysed, sometimes even given purposes within society despite their deficiencies. Enki, ever practical, finds roles for the failed experiments, suggesting they can serve as priests, musicians, or servants in capacities that don't require full physical capability. But the goal is clear: create a worker strong enough for physical labour, intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, capable of reproducing to maintain population without requiring constant creation. After the failed experiments, Ninmah refines her technique. The proportions are adjusted. The activation procedure is perfected. Eventually she creates beings who meet all the specifications, 14 in the first successful batch, 7 male and 7 female, a breeding population that can expand naturally. The texts then describe these first humans being put to work in Eden, the plain between the rivers, taking over the canal digging and field clearing that the Igigi had abandoned. The experiment succeeds. Humans multiply. Spread across Mesopotamia, perform the labour for which they were designed. The Atrahasis epic is explicit. Humans were created to bear the yoke of the gods, to carry the work basket, to relieve the Anunnaki of physical toil. This wasn't poetic metaphor. This was the stated purpose, recorded in texts that treated human creation as a solution to a labour shortage, an engineering project undertaken when the original workforce refused to continue their assignments. The Sumerian texts refer to a place called Eden, located in the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the first humans were put to work. Eden meant plain, or steppe in Sumerian, and texts describe it as a place where the Anunnaki established gardens and agricultural operations. The word entered Akkadian as Edinu and eventually Hebrew as Eden, but the Sumerian references treat it as a geographical location, not a paradise. The Eridu Genesis mentions Eden as the place where cities had not yet been built, where humanity was created to work the fields after the Igigi refused to continue. Archaeological surveys of southern Iraq have revealed extensive ancient irrigation systems in the plain between the rivers, dating to the earliest periods of Sumerian civilization, exactly where the texts locate Eden. The Sumerian poem The Marriage of Martu describes the Eden as a borderland, a place where civilized Sumerians didn't want to live but where work needed to be done, which matches the textual context for why humans were created there. The word Eden appears throughout Sumerian literature with consistent meaning: the plain, the steppe, the open land between established settlements. It wasn't paradise. It was the frontier, the undeveloped territory where agriculture could be established but where the work was hard and conditions were harsh. The Sumerians who lived in cities viewed the Eden as backward, uncivilized, a place you went when necessary but not somewhere you'd choose to live. The Eridu Genesis places the creation of humanity specifically in Eden. After the Anunnaki established their first cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak, they needed the surrounding plains cultivated to provide food for growing populations. But cultivating the Eden meant back-breaking labour, clearing wild growth. digging irrigation channels, planting and harvesting in a landscape that was hot, dry and unforgiving. The Igigi had done this work until they rebelled. Humans were created to take over, placed in Eden specifically to transform it from wild plain to productive agricultural land. The texts describe gardens being established in Eden, not as pleasure gardens but as working agricultural installations. Orchards, vegetable plots, grain fields, all requiring constant irrigation, weeding, tending. Humans provided the labour force necessary to maintain these operations. The biblical Eden, a paradise garden, derives from this Sumerian Eden, but the original context was far more mundane, a work site, an agricultural zone. A place where humans were assigned to toil. Archaeological evidence supports the textual references. Surveys across southern Iraq have mapped extensive ancient irrigation systems in the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates. These systems date to the earliest periods of Sumerian civilization, around 5,500 to 5,200 BCE, exactly the time frame when the texts describe humans being created and put to work in Eden. The canals were sophisticated, carefully engineered to distribute water efficiently across vast areas. Someone designed these systems with advanced hydraulic knowledge. Someone supervised their construction and maintenance. And someone, thousands of someones, did the actual digging year after year, generation after generation. The poem, quote 110, quote, provides additional context. In this text, a young woman from the city is courted by Martu, a man from the Eden. Her family disapproves because Eden dwellers are considered uncivilized. They don't live in proper houses, they eat raw meat, they don't bury their dead properly. The Eden is portrayed as rough country, populated by people who work with their hands, who live close to the earth, who haven't adopted full urban sophistication. This matches exactly the context of humans being created for agricultural labour, in a landscape the Anunnaki themselves found too harsh for long-term residents. Eden wasn't a lost paradise from which humans were expelled. It was the work site where humans were first deployed, the agricultural zone they were designed to cultivate. The later transformation of this place name into the biblical Eden, a paradise garden where humanity lived in innocent leisure until sin brought labour as punishment, inverts the Sumerian reality. In the Sumerian version, humans were created specifically for labour, placed in Eden to work from the very beginning. Fashioned with the strength and endurance necessary for agricultural toil in an unforgiving landscape. The biblical story of Cain and Abel originates in Sumerian texts that provide more context. In earlier versions preserved on fragmentary tablets, there's reference to a mark placed on certain humans to designate them as protected, set apart, not to be harmed by others. This mark, according to some interpretations of damaged sections, identified individuals who'd been selected for specific tasks or who carried a genetic heritage that needed to be preserved. The Sumerian context suggests this wasn't divine mercy for a murderer but a practical designation, marking certain lineages as valuable or distinct. When the king list notes which kings could trace ancestry to specific Anunnaki, it's making a similar distinction. These weren't claims of divine favour in the way later religions would understand it, but statements about heredity and genetic heritage that conveyed real administrative authority and extended lifespan compared to common humans. The biblical account of Cain and Abel is familiar. Two brothers, one a farmer, one a shepherd. Cain's offering is rejected while Abel's is accepted. Cain murders Abel in jealous rage. God curses Cain to wander, but places a mark on him so no one will kill him. The story seems to be about sin, punishment, and divine mercy. But earlier Sumerian fragments suggest different context entirely. In texts from Nippur and Eridu, there are references to marks or signs placed on certain humans to designate them as belonging to specific Anunnaki, as being under their protection, or as carrying genetic heritage that needed to be preserved. These weren't moral judgments, they were practical designations, identifiers that conveyed information about lineage and status. A human bearing the mark of Enki, for instance, might have been one of the early genetic experiments, someone carrying more Anunnaki DNA than common humans, someone whose bloodline was valuable enough to warrant protection and continuation. The Cain story, stripped of its later moral overlay, might preserve memory of these marked lineages. Cain, a farmer, works the earth. He's engaged in the primary task humans were created to perform. Abel, a shepherd, represents later diversification of labour. The rejection of Cain's offering and acceptance of Abel's might reflect not divine preference, but some distinction in their heritage, some difference in how they were valued by the Anunnaki overseers. Cain's subsequent murder of Abel breaks a rule, disrupts the breeding program or work assignment system. The punishment is exile, but the mark protects him from being killed by others who might otherwise view him as criminal or outcast. What was this mark? The texts don't specify its physical form, only that it was recognizable, that it conveyed protection, that it identified Cain as someone not to be harmed despite his crime. In Sumerian context, marks or signs associated with specific Anunnaki appear in various texts. Symbols carved or painted, signs worn as identification, designations that conveyed belonging or protection. The mark might have been literal. A tattoo or brand identifying Cain's lineage and ensuring he would be recognized wherever he wandered. The king list provides parallel evidence. When listing certain kings, the text notes their descent from specific Anunnaki. Lugalbanda, son of Enki, or similar designations appear, stating genetic heritage as fact. These weren't symbolic spiritual adoptions, they were statements about biology, about which kings carried enough Anunnaki genetics to warrant recognition, extended lifespans, and political authority that derived from heritage rather than human accomplishment alone. The repeated emphasis on genealogy, the careful tracking of who descended from whom, suggests the Sumerians understood that genetic heritage mattered, that those with more Anunnaki DNA possessed capabilities and longevity that purely human individuals lacked. Kings with documented Anunnaki ancestry ruled longer, according to the king list. They're recorded as living hundreds of years compared to the tens of years of later, purely human rulers. This wasn't divine blessing bestowed for righteousness. This was biology, the expression of mixed genetics that manifested in extended lifespan, greater strength, enhanced capabilities. The marks, the genealogies, the careful documentation all serve to track these special lineages, to identify individuals whose heritage made them different from common humans, created purely from the clay and blood mixture in Enki's laboratory. The Tower of Babel story, known to most from Genesis, has Sumerian antecedents in texts describing a time when all humanity spoke one language and attempted to build a structure that would reach unto heaven. The Sumerian version, fragmentary but present in texts from Eridu and Nippur, describes this differently. In the Sumerian context, building a structure to reach heaven wasn't hubris. Humans were simply continuing the architectural traditions they'd been taught by the Anunnaki, constructing tall temples called ziggurats as meeting points between earth and sky. The confusion of languages, according to earlier sources, occurred when the Anunnaki withdrew from direct contact with humanity, deliberately fragmenting the unified language to prevent coordination on certain kinds of projects. Scholar Stephen Langdon, working with tablets in the Weld-Blundell collection in the 1920s, found references suggesting this linguistic fragmentation was a deliberate policy enacted after the flood, a way of limiting humanity's capabilities while still allowing them to serve their created purpose. The ziggurat was the most distinctive architectural form in Mesopotamia, a stepped pyramid built of millions of baked bricks, rising in tiers toward the sky. Every major Sumerian city had one. They served as meeting points between the Anunnaki and humans, temples where the sky dwellers could descend and humans could ascend partway toward heaven. The architecture itself embodied the connection between earth and sky. physical structures designed to bridge the gap between the two realms. The biblical Tower of Babel is usually interpreted as a story about human pride being punished by divine intervention. Humans attempt to build a tower to reach heaven. God confuses their language so they can't coordinate. The project collapses into chaos. But the Sumerian fragments suggest different context. Humans weren't rebelling against the Anunnaki by building tall structures. They were doing exactly what they'd been taught to do, following the architectural principles the Anunnaki had instructed them in, constructing temples in the style they'd learned. The confusion of languages appears in Sumerian sources not as punishment for pride, but as deliberate policy. Stephen Langdon, one of the great early Assyriologists, spent years working with tablets in the Weld-Blundell collection at Oxford. Among these tablets were fragments describing a time when, quote, 113, quote. The text continues with a damage section, but what remains suggests that this linguistic unity ended not by accident but by decision. That the Anunnaki chose to fragment human language for specific purposes. Why would the Anunnaki want to prevent linguistic unity? The texts hint at several possibilities. A unified language meant humans could coordinate across vast distances, share knowledge efficiently, organize projects that might not align with Anunnaki interests. After the flood, after the decision to limit humanity's capabilities and lifespan, linguistic fragmentation became another method of control. Different regions would develop different languages, preventing easy communication between populations, making large-scale coordination difficult, ensuring that humans remained manageable. The timing suggested by the texts is significant. The confusion of languages occurred after the flood, during the period when the Anunnaki were withdrawing from direct contact, establishing a new relationship with humanity that involved more distance and less direct oversight. Fragmenting language would have been part of this transition, a way to maintain control while reducing the number of Anunnaki who needed to be stationed on Earth. If humans couldn't easily communicate across regions, each population could be managed locally without risk of coordinated actions across the entire civilization. Langdon noted that the Sumerian texts treated this linguistic fragmentation as historical event, not mythological allegory. The texts before this period describe humanity speaking one language. The text after describe multiple languages, with scribes needed to translate between them. With communication across regions becoming more difficult, the change was remembered, recorded, attributed to deliberate action by the Anunnaki rather than natural linguistic drift, and the texts connect this fragmentation to the tower building episode, suggesting that humanity's demonstrated ability to coordinate massive construction projects prompted the decision to limit their linguistic unity. The ziggurats themselves continued to be built, of course. The Anunnaki still needed these structures, still used them as descent points and meeting places. But after the confusion of languages, humans couldn't coordinate to build anything much larger or more sophisticated than what the Anunnaki explicitly authorized and supervised. The great age of massive unified construction had ended, replaced by an era of smaller, more controlled building projects that posed no threat to the hierarchy the Anunnaki had established. The biblical Nephilim, described as offspring of quote 114 quote and quote 115 quote, appear in more detail in Mesopotamian sources as a specific problem the senior Anunnaki tried to prevent. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period reference regulations preventing interbreeding between the Anunnaki and humans, suggesting such mixing had occurred and produced offspring who didn't fit neatly into either category. Gilgamesh himself is described as 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a genetic ratio that gave him exceptional strength and longevity but not immortality. The council's decision to send the flood is linked in some texts to eliminating these mixed bloodlines, which had grown in number and power. Enki's decision to save Ziusudra preserved a sample of pure human lineage, but the texts hint that mixed heritage individuals survived in the mountains, accounting for the hero lineages that appear in post-flood histories. This wasn't religious metaphor about divine parentage. The Sumerian context treats it as biological reality with political implications. The Book of Genesis mentions the Nephilim only briefly. Quote, 117. The passage is cryptic, offering no explanation of who the Nephilim were or why their existence mattered. But Mesopotamian texts provide extensive context that illuminates what Genesis only hints at. The problem was genetic mixing. Humans had been created with specific design parameters. Intelligent enough for complex labour but with limited lifespan, strong but not as strong as the Anunnaki, capable but constrained. But some Anunnaki, living among humans, directing their work, began forming relationships with human women. The offspring of these unions inherited mixed genetics, part Anunnaki, part human, resulting in individuals whose capabilities exceeded normal human limits. These mixed offspring were stronger, lived longer, possessed abilities that made them stand out among purely human populations. They became leaders, warriors, heroes. The texts describe them as, quote, 118, quote, individuals whose accomplishments and longevity elevated them above common humanity. But from the Anunnaki perspective, these hybrids represented a problem. They upset the careful balance of the created order, producing a population that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite Anunnaki, didn't fit neatly into the hierarchy that had been established. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period contained fragmentary references to regulations enacted to prevent such mixing. The Anunnaki Council apparently issued decrees restricting relationships between Anunnaki and humans, attempting to maintain genetic boundaries to prevent the continued creation of hybrid lineages. But enforcement was difficult, especially in early periods when Anunnaki lived in close proximity to human populations. The mixing continued despite regulations, and the hybrid population grew. Gilgamesh provides the most famous example. The epic explicitly states he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a specific genetic ratio that's impossible if we think in purely biological terms. You can't be 2/3 of one parent and 1/3 of the other. But if Gilgamesh's mother was fully Anunnaki, and his father was half Anunnaki, half human, the ratio makes sense. Gilgamesh inherited exceptional strength, ruled for 126 years, performed feats no normal human could accomplish. Yet he wasn't immortal. He aged, slowly compared to humans, but he aged nonetheless. And when Enkidu died, Gilgamesh confronted the reality that his mixed heritage gave him advantages, but not the full immortality of pure Anunnaki lineage. The flood narrative in the Atrahasis epic links the decision to destroy humanity specifically to these mixed bloodlines. The text suggests that by the time the flood was decreed, the hybrid population had grown numerous and powerful, perhaps threatening the control the pure Anunnaki maintained over human civilization. Eliminating humanity would eliminate the hybrids, resetting the genetic landscape, allowing the Anunnaki to start over with stricter controls on mixing. But Enki's intervention saved not just pure humans, but likely some hybrid lineages as well. The text says Ziusudra brought his family aboard the boat, along with craftsmen and skilled workers. If any of these carried Anunnaki genetics, the flood didn't eliminate mixed bloodlines, it merely reduced them. And indeed, post-flood texts continue to mention heroes with exceptional lifespans and capabilities, suggesting hybrid lineages survived and continued, though perhaps in smaller numbers and under stricter supervision than before the catastrophe. The Nephilim and their hybrids weren't mythological giants or spiritual beings. They were genetic anomalies, the biological result of Anunnaki-human mixing, individuals whose existence demonstrated that the two species were close enough genetically to produce viable offspring, but different enough that those offspring possessed capabilities outside normal human range. The Anunnaki viewed this as a problem requiring management, a threat to the established order that needed to be controlled through policy, regulation, and ultimately catastrophic intervention. The Sumerian texts chart a clear arc of declining Anunnaki involvement with humanity. In the earliest periods, immediately after creation, The Anunnaki lived among humans, directing their work, teaching crafts and agriculture. The texts from this era describe direct interaction, with Anunnaki visiting cities, settling disputes, and selecting kings. But starting around 3000 BCE, something changed. The texts begin describing the Anunnaki as more distant, communicating through priests and kings rather than directly, appearing less frequently. By the time of the Akkadian Empire around 2300 BCE, the Anunnaki are described primarily as residing in temples, making decisions from their seats, but rarely appearing in person. The latest Sumerian and Akkadian texts, from the early 2nd millennium BCE, speak of the Anunnaki almost nostalgically, as beings who once walked the earth but whose direct presence had faded. Priest-kings claim to receive instructions in dreams or visions rather than face-to-face. Something changed, and the texts record that change over centuries. The earliest Sumerian texts from before 3000 BCE describe a world where Anunnaki and humans interacted directly and frequently. Anunnaki walked through cities, inspecting work, settling disputes between humans, selecting individuals for specific tasks or honours. Kings received their authority directly from Anunnaki in face-to-face meetings where assignments were given and expectations communicated. The texts treat this as normal, expected, the way the world worked. But something shifted around the turn of the 3rd millennium. The texts become less direct about Anunnaki presence. Instead of describing physical meetings, they begin referencing communications through intermediaries. A king receives instructions, quote, 119, quote, rather than in person. A priest conveys the will of an Anunnaki, rather than the Anunnaki speaking directly to the people. The language suggests distance, separation, a withdrawal from the immediate presence that characterized earlier periods. By the time of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon and his successors, around 2300 BCE, the Anunnaki are described primarily as temple residents, present in their designated cities but no longer walking among humans as they once had. Kings still claim to receive divine guidance, but always through priestly intermediaries, through dreams, through signs and omens rather than direct conversation. The immediacy was gone, replaced by a formalized, distant relationship mediated through religious hierarchy. The change appears to have been gradual rather than sudden, over centuries. The Anunnaki withdrew step by step, reducing their visible presence, limiting their direct contact, establishing systems that could function with less immediate oversight. Perhaps they simply left, most of them, returning to wherever they came from, leaving behind only a skeleton crew to maintain basic supervision through temples and priesthoods. Perhaps they retreated to specific locations, no longer distributing themselves across all of Mesopotamia, but consolidating in a few centres from which they could exercise remote control. The texts from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 to 1600 BCE, speak of the Anunnaki almost nostalgically. Quote, 20 becomes a common phrase, suggesting the writers recognized they lived in an age different from what came before. The Anunnaki had once been physically present, directly involved in human affairs. Now they were distant, their will communicated through intermediaries, their presence felt more through tradition and religious structure than through actual physical appearance. What caused this withdrawal? The texts don't explicitly say, but we can piece together possibilities from various sources. Perhaps the flood and its aftermath convinced the Anunnaki that direct involvement was too costly, too complicated, too likely to produce problems like hybrid populations and human expectations of ongoing divine presence. Perhaps their purpose on Earth, establishing civilization, creating a productive workforce, extracting whatever resources or conducting whatever projects brought them here, had been accomplished, or at least reached a point where close supervision was no longer necessary. Perhaps they simply decided to leave, returning home, abandoning Earth to the humans they'd created except for minimal oversight. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, the Anunnaki had effectively become myths, even while they remained part of active religious practice. Temples were still maintained for them, offerings still provided, prayers still offered. But no one expected them to physically appear anymore. The age of direct contact had ended, replaced by an age of distant deities. Of gods who ruled from heaven rather than walking the earth, of authorities remembered more than experienced. The transition was complete. Humanity had gone from being directly supervised by physical Anunnaki to being managed through religious and political hierarchies that claimed to represent Anunnaki will but rarely, if ever, involved actual Anunnaki presence. Perhaps the most intriguing objects mentioned repeatedly in Mesopotamian texts are the tablets of destiny. Described as physical objects that conveyed supreme authority to whoever possessed them. Multiple myths involve theft or transfer of these tablets. In the quote, 121, a bird-like being steals the tablets of destiny from Enlil while he's bathing, throwing the cosmos into chaos until the warrior god Ninurta retrieves them. The tablets are described as containing all decrees, as allowing their holder to command absolutely, and as being guarded more carefully than anything else. They weren't made of clay like ordinary tablets. They're described as different, imperishable, containing what sounds like encoded information. When Marduk rises to supremacy in later Babylonian theology, his legitimacy is established by his possession of the tablets of destiny passed to him by Anu. These weren't symbolic objects representing abstract authority. The texts treat them as devices, crucial technology that literally conveyed power to operate systems or command obedience. The tablets of destiny appear in myth after myth, always as objects of supreme importance, always guarded carefully, always sought by those who want ultimate authority. They weren't one object, but potentially multiple tablets, though some texts suggest a primary set held by the supreme authority. What made them special? Why did possessing them convey absolute power? The texts describe them as containing all decrees or all destinies. Whoever held them could decree fate, could make decisions that bound all others, could command absolutely. The language suggests they weren't symbolic but functional, that they literally gave their holder capabilities others didn't possess. Modern translators have struggled with how to interpret this. Surely these are metaphorical, representing legitimate authority rather than actually conveying power. But the Sumerians and Akkadians didn't write as if they were being metaphorical. They described these tablets as actual objects whose possession changed everything. The myth of Anzu provides the most detailed account of what happened when the tablets of destiny were stolen. Anzu was a divine being, described as having the body of an eagle and the head of a lion, who served Enlil in the Ekur. One day, while Enlil was bathing, in a moment of vulnerability when he'd removed his regalia, Anzu seized the tablets of destiny and fled. The text says that immediately the divine plans came to a halt and silence spread, stillness prevailed. The theft didn't just remove Enlil's authority symbolically, it actually stopped systems from functioning, as if the tablets operated equipment or controlled processes that ceased when they were removed from authorized hands. The Anunnaki Council convened in emergency session. They needed the tablets retrieved immediately, but the problem was that whoever now possessed them held supreme authority. How do you command someone to retrieve an object that gives the thief command over you? Multiple Anunnaki are asked to pursue Anzu, and each refuses, recognizing the logical impossibility. Finally, Ninurta, the warrior god, accepts the mission. The text describes a battle where Ninurta must physically overcome Anzu and seize the tablets, suggesting they couldn't simply be commanded away from the thief. They had to be taken by force. When Ninurta succeeds and returns the tablets of destiny to Enlil, systems resume functioning, authority is re-established, order returns. The tablets weren't just symbols. They were operational equipment, crucial to the administrative and perhaps technological control the Anunnaki exercised over their domain. Without them, even Enlil couldn't function as supreme commander. With them, Even a rebel like Anzu temporarily held unchallengeable authority. Later texts describe the tablets of destiny being passed to Marduk as he rose to supremacy in Babylonian theology. Anu, acknowledging Marduk's victory over Tiamat and his role in organizing creation, formally transfers the tablets to him, establishing Marduk's legitimate authority over the pantheon. The transfer is ceremonial but legally binding. Once Marduk possessed the tablets of destiny, his supremacy was unquestionable, encoded in the very objects that conveyed command authority. What were these tablets physically? The texts say they weren't made of clay like ordinary writing tablets. They were imperishable, couldn't be destroyed, contained information in a form that was different from normal cuneiform script. They sound like advanced technology, like devices that stored encoded information, that interfaced with other systems, that literally conveyed command authority to whoever possessed the correct access codes, or biometric authentication. In a world where the Anunnaki possessed technology far beyond what humans had, such devices would have been absolutely crucial. The master controls, the admin access, the keys to every system they'd established. The Sumerian texts would be easier to dismiss as pure mythology if archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia fit neatly into conventional models of gradual cultural development. But it doesn't. Sumerian civilization appears suddenly, around 3400 BCE, already possessing writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex architecture, metallurgy, and urban planning. There's no clear evidence of slow development. The difference between settlements before and after this date is startling. The Sumerians themselves insisted their knowledge was taught to them, that the Anunnaki had instructed them in all essential crafts. Early excavators like Leonard Woolley found this claim puzzling, because the sophistication of early Sumerian culture seemed too advanced for its date. More recent archaeological surveys have revealed evidence of advanced hydraulic engineering, astronomical alignments in temple architecture, and mathematical precision in city planning from the very beginning of the civilization. The Sumerians also possessed detailed astronomical knowledge, including the precession of the equinoxes, that conventional scholarship can't explain how they acquired, given their tools and time frame. When we find knowledge in the texts that seems impossible for their era, we assume myth. But what if the texts were simply recording what had been taught to them by beings whose knowledge base was far more advanced than early Bronze Age humans should have possessed? Around 3400 BCE, something remarkable happened in southern Mesopotamia. Within a few centuries, a geological eye blink, small farming villages transformed into sophisticated urban centres with monumental architecture, complex administrative systems, and technologies that shouldn't have existed yet. Uruk grew from a settlement to a city of tens of thousands, with massive temple complexes, defensive walls, irrigation systems of remarkable sophistication. Writing appeared, not gradually but suddenly, already capable of recording complex economic transactions and literary texts. The wheel was invented, or appeared, revolutionizing transportation and pottery manufacture. Metallurgy advanced rapidly, producing bronze tools and weapons of surprising quality. Conventional archaeology explains this as the urban revolution, a period of rapid development driven by population pressure, environmental changes, and human innovation. But the speed troubles some scholars. Civilizations usually develop gradually, building on accumulated knowledge over many generations. The Sumerian explosion was different. It appeared almost fully formed, as if the knowledge had come from somewhere else and been implemented rapidly rather than discovered slowly through trial and error. Leonard Woolley, excavating in the 1920s and 30s, noted this anomaly repeatedly in his publications. The earliest Sumerian architecture he uncovered was already sophisticated, showing advanced knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and urban planning. There was no progression from crude to refined. The earlier structures were carefully planned, precisely built, oriented to astronomical alignments with accuracy that required advanced observational knowledge. Woolley wrote that it was as if, the Sumerians had been taught these skills rather than developing them independently, though he immediately qualified this as speculation since the alternative was to accept the Sumerian texts literally. But what if we did take the texts literally? The Sumerians never claimed to have invented writing, mathematics, or astronomy. They explicitly stated that these were gifts from the Anunnaki, that Enki taught them the arts of civilization, that Inanna brought cultural knowledge to Uruk from Eridu, that every essential craft and skill came from the gods who walked among them. If the Anunnaki were real, if they possessed advanced knowledge and deliberately instructed early humans, then Sumerian civilization's sudden appearance makes sense. It wasn't humans slowly figuring things out. It was humans being taught by those who already knew. The astronomical knowledge is particularly puzzling. The Sumerians tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes about 26,000 years to complete one cycle and requires centuries of careful observation to detect. They mapped the stars with precision, identified planets, predicted eclipses, calculated celestial cycles. How did early Bronze Age people, without telescopes or sophisticated instruments, acquire this knowledge? The conventional answer is patient observation over many generations. But the Sumerians themselves said they were taught, that the Anunnaki who came from the stars showed them how the heavens worked, shared knowledge of celestial mechanics that humans couldn't have discovered independently with their limited tools and short time frame. The hydraulic engineering is equally impressive. The irrigation systems across southern Mesopotamia show sophisticated understanding of water flow, gradient management, and large-scale coordination. These weren't trial-and-error local projects. These were engineered systems, planned comprehensively, built with knowledge of principles that shouldn't have been available to people just emerging from Neolithic farming culture. Yet there they are, dug precisely, functioning efficiently, dating to the very beginning of Sumerian civilization, as if they were part of the initial plan rather than later innovations. The mathematics embedded in temple architecture reveals knowledge of geometry, astronomical cycles, and proportional relationships that's sophisticated. The temples weren't placed randomly. They aligned with specific stars, oriented to cardinal directions with precision, incorporated mathematical ratios that later cultures would rediscover and name after Greek mathematicians. All of this was present from the beginning, as if someone who already possessed the knowledge supervised the construction, teaching humans how to build according to principles they hadn't discovered for themselves. When we find this kind of advanced knowledge in texts and artifacts from 3400 BCE, we call it anomalous, unexplained, puzzling. We assume the Sumerians must have been more sophisticated than we give them credit for, or that their knowledge came from gradual development we simply haven't found evidence for yet. But there's another explanation, one the Sumerians themselves provided. They were taught. The Anunnaki, beings from elsewhere with knowledge humans didn't possess, instructed them in the essential technologies and skills that allowed civilization to emerge rapidly in the land between the rivers. The texts aren't mythology, they're records, chronicles of a time when humanity answered to teachers from the sky who shared selected knowledge while maintaining hierarchical control over the species they had created to serve their purposes on Earth. And so the tablets rest now in museums across the world, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to ask in the right way. For 5,000 years these clay fragments have waited, patient as stone, carrying records of a time when the lines between myth and history weren't drawn where we draw them now. When the beings we've been calling gods were described by those who knew them not as distant cosmic forces, but as physical authorities who walk the earth, who created humans for specific purposes, who taught selected knowledge while maintaining careful control over the species they had fashioned from clay and blood. What changes if we read the texts as the Sumerians wrote them, without imposing our assumptions about what's possible? What emerges if we take seriously their insistence that civilization was taught, not invented, that the Anunnaki descended from the sky with knowledge already complete? Perhaps we discover that the ancient world was stranger and more literal than we've allowed ourselves to believe, that the foundations of human civilization rest on interactions we've been interpreting as mythology when they might have been something closer to memory, preserved across millennia in tablets pressed by scribes who had no reason to think future readers would doubt every word. The Anunnaki, if the texts are even partially accurate, were never gods in the way we understand divinity. They were beings with advanced knowledge, with technology that seemed miraculous to early humans, with purposes on Earth that required a labour force they designed and created for specific tasks. They lived among humans, taught them, controlled them, withdrew gradually until only their temples and their legends remained. And humans, fashioned in the image of beings from elsewhere, continued building the civilizations those teachers had initiated, carrying forward knowledge whose origins had already begun fading into myth even while the cities still stood. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness where those ancient clay tablets rested beneath Mesopotamian sand, waiting to be found. Rest under the same stars the Anunnaki and their human subjects both watched, connected across 5,000 years to questions that still echo through ruins and museum archives, through texts that refuse to fit neatly into categories we've built around them. The ancient world holds its mysteries still, patient and inexhaustible. But for now, let those mysteries wait. Let the questions rest. Let yourself slip into the quiet where time moves differently, where past and present blur, where sleep comes gently like dust settling over forgotten cities. Rest now. The tablets will still be there, still holding their secrets, when you wake.